Hey class, heck, got some great questions on that recent quiz of yours, the checkup on the introduction to government. I'm going to take some time to answer some of them. If you had a really unique question, I was really impressed with some of them. Some of them were really unique, really tied to historical facts. I answered it in the lesson. I'm going to take some time to answer some of the most common questions right now. A couple of the questions around that's centered around: are we going to cover this? Are we going to cover that? Maybe make sure you check out the syllabus. So that will give you a good overview of whether we're going to cover that. We'll mix in current events and historical events, and we'll also do our best to have some good debate on some things that are not quite black and white. So, without further ado, let's begin on some of the top questions that I received. Uh, Again, there were many good questions. I was really impressed. Okay, why isn't America referred to a democracy if it isn't? As I gave you that one video it's on my YouTube channel if you want to really check it out, which is where this video is too. Why there were only two types of governments, really oligarchies and uh, republics, essentially, or oligarchies and well, there were. See, recording these videos is not always easy, but it went into why dictatorships were really oligarchies and democracies were also really oligarchies, ruled by a few. And, you always hear the United States is a democracy, but that video really showed that, no, we're a republic, and I went to explain that as well. So, why are we considered a democracy still? Well, we have many democratic elements, right? We still elect officials, whether in Congress or at the local level, really by popular vote. Laws are made by majority vote in many ways, but we're not a democracy in the sense that the majority rules everything, right? People you may disagree with still have a voice through the First Amendment. They're free to express their opinion without harm from the government. And if you have a democracy that runs the government, technically it's just ruled by majority, and whatever minority voice has no voice. That's not the case in our country. Even the minority voice, regardless of how big it is, still has a voice in our country today, and therefore we are a republic. In addition, there's some other checks on the majority to make sure that the majority isn't making bad decisions and, in fact, could be wrong sometimes. Why aren't the 50 states a state as in a sovereign state? Good question. Essentially, it comes down to sovereignty. The 50 states do not have full sovereignty. The federal government can tell them that we want you to pay this much in taxes, that you're going to abide by this law in terms of what education is provided from time to time. You're going to allow us to put a military base there if we want. All those things really explain why a state isn't a state in the sense of when we're talking about New York or California or Washington. However, there is a historical connotation. The states at one point had much more sovereignty than they did now, and in many ways were more like a state. And really, when the country was founded, it was almost envisioned that they would be a state like we're talking about in government. That's not the case anymore, and that's why internationally they were not a state, but they're still called a state. I know it gets confusing because of the historical connotations. What would happen if the United States turned into a dictatorship? Well, some would argue it already is. Some people would argue that pretty much under every president since Hoover, pretty much. Maybe even Wilson, maybe even Theodore Roosevelt. Jackson, yeah, Jackson's a good point too. Was Mr. Holden interjecting? So people have argued we've been dictatorship for a long time. The presidency is in fact a de facto dictatorship. There's some truth to that. The president can do a lot without Congress and has done a lot without Congress. The president can order you killed in the middle of your night and Congress wouldn't question him. So there is some debate that we already are a dictatorship. But I think when people are asking this question, they're referring to what would happen if we were a dictatorship like Nazi Germany or North Korea or you could argue Venezuela. I would imagine the same things would happen and that happened in those countries would happen in this country. Abuse of power, indiscriminate killings, the forced takeover of personal property, you name it. It really depends on the dictator. I don't want to sit here and assume that all dictatorships throughout history have been bad. They certainly have been controversial, but some have been better than others, right? You could have a benevolent dictator who really does care about the people under their care or under their government, and by and large, people like them. This is it's interesting in Saudi Arabia. People, I don't want to generalize, but for the most part, they like their monarchy. Obviously, there's abuses there, but it really depends on the person in some ways when you have a dictatorship. But many of the same things would probably happen. And I would maybe go a little bit further and ask you, well, if it did, what would you do? What would you think? If it came down to it, what would you think? All right. Not all get all doom and gloom now. All right, these were a couple really good questions that I thought were really interesting. Would Martin Luther King Jr. be able to become president today? I don't personally think so, even though he was able to really unite a bunch of different groups of people. Racism, frankly, is still an issue because we're human. It was interesting. I was listening to a evolutionary biologist, and it's not to say I agree with every point he said, but he raised the point and said that naturally we sometimes don't want to be with other groups of people because historically other groups of people, when they came in contact with each other, kill each other through disease. I don't know if I entirely buy that, but it was food for thought. As opposed to why is racism still an issue? Ultimately, I can't answer that. I have my personal theories, but I'll leave it at the fact that people are still human is what it comes down to. But do I think Martin Luther King Jr. would be able to become president today? I personally don't think so. I don't personally think Ronald Reagan would have been able to become president today. And that is really due to the fact that I think people are more polarized than they ever have been, at least in recent times. Why are people homeless? Or why doesn't the government take care of people that are homeless? Well, the government does do a lot to take care of people that are homeless. If you interact with the homeless enough, you'll find that sometimes they don't want those services. So there is some personal responsibility there. And whenever we talk about, I highlighted this question, but there was a lot of other questions like why doesn't the government take care of wealth inequality, or why doesn't the government take care of crime? The government tries, but then we also have to raise the question of where's your personal responsibility too. It's what we're going to find in this course is oftentimes the government falls far short of its intended goals and often creates unintended consequences, and that's where personal responsibility comes in. This question was really good. What can someone that's a teenager today do to get involved in government? Well, there's a lot of things. You can help someone get elected. That might mean going door to door and just passing out information. It might mean raising money for them. It might mean making phone calls. It might mean showing up at a rally of some sort or a town hall. It might be going to a town hall to voice your concerns. I remember very clearly when I was 14, we were going to have this huge housing development built really close in this floodplain. In fact, talking about hurricanes, there was a hurricane that happened that year. It was not, I think it was 1999, Hurricane Floyd, and this whole area flooded. There wasn't going to be any houses built there if that flooded. It was torrential. And I remember going to this town hall and expressing, I don't know how you guys can even consider allowing homes to be built here when this just flooded, 3 days ago. What if we get a storm like that again? then the township's going to be on the hook for some of that money. I don't think this is a good idea. So you go to your local township meetings. They're often very small, and there's often time to share your thoughts or concerns. Um, you can write or call your representative to share any thoughts you have with them. I had a student a couple years ago schedule a meeting with their state senator, and I went with them, and we shared some thoughts on school choice at the time. So those are just a few ways. Many people consider political parties a panacea to good government, but they do help organize people and they do provide ways to get involved as well. So you could also check out your uh, local party affiliation, whatever you affiliate as, and they typically have a local office. Call them and see, hey, what can I do? Where do you need people to help? Um, at the school level, you could also check out student government. That would be a good way to get involved, just even in our school community. So that was a really good question, and I was really encouraged to see that. So there's a plethora of ways, and hopefully this course gives you a few more ways to get involved. So thanks, guys. Those were some of the top questions. If you really, really wanted your question answered, some of them, like I said, were better than others, and I try to answer some of the more unique questions. Let me know. But those were the top ones, and if you ask a question, hopefully it satisfies some of the curiosity. Great job.